All right, we're going to roll right in. And if you have been attending the last couple of webinars, it's about the first, I think I measured it last time, I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes of intro material that gets sort of duplicated from one to another. So if you want to tune out for a few minutes because you've heard all this before, go for it. I'm Emily Twardy, your host of Ask an Agroforester. Sesha Warren, who just turned screen off, which is totally fine, is here in the background. She is my partner in crime. She's an awesome gal. She heads up our AFT NRP program, which you'll hear more about in a minute. And of course, we've got Zach Elfers, if you want to say hi, Zach.
Hey, everybody.
And
It's
this,
nice to see some
yeah,
faces I recognize here. Alexis Campbell at the Horn Farm Center, Mike Gold at Mizzou Agroforestry, Colin
yeah.
Lilly.
Mike was here last week too. So it's always fun to see people coming back for more content. We appreciate it. Um, So today's webinar is made possible by the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation with some generous funding to ASD and Virginia Tech as well. So thank you, EMEF. We are super, super thrilled to be able to keep bringing these sessions forward. Here's where we're headed today. We're going to be talking about honey locusts and a little bit about fruit exploration as well, forest exploration. Looking forward to it. Just some of the quick opening information. Here's where we're going. We're going to do this welcome. We're going to introduce our host, ASD, and our programming. We're going to introduce our guest, Zach, and then we are going to have him present. After that, we have about an hour of live Q&A. The first bit of that is going to be some pre-collected questions. We've got a few folks who submitted questions ahead of time. We've got some frequently asked questions that Zach gets about this kind of stuff. So we'll hit those and then we'll move into the live Q&A part from there. Just a reminder, we are recording. These will upload to YouTube. We're working on getting the first couple sessions processed right now. And those should be up in the next, I would say, 2 weeks. And this should follow along shortly thereafter. If you need closed captioning, there's a little CC button. You can click on that and some auto-generated captions will pop up. This can actually be super useful even if you're just in a loud room or someone's audio isn't super clear or it's an accent that you're not familiar with. Closed captioning is really, really useful. You might be in a cafe watching on mute or something. In general today, the chat is open, but it's mostly just for chatting. If you want to actually ask questions, if there's something you want to make sure that Zach addresses, please enter it into the Q&A. You also have the opportunity to open that window and like upvote other people's questions or comment on their questions, provide answers, drop links, all of that kind of stuff. So the Q&A is open for everybody. Feel free to get in there and use that. And that's where we will be focusing the actual like content of Q&A. So if you put a question in the chat, it may not make it over there unless somebody copies and pastes it for you. So ASD, our mission is to build a thriving regional food and ag system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. So who are we? We are a nonprofit. We've been working since 95, so we're about to turn 30. And we're really working to grow a stronger Appalachia, specifically through agriculture. So even though our work falls into these 5 key areas, it's all sort of under the ag umbrella. So we have workforce development, agriculture education, food access, economic development, and resources conservation. The map you see on the right is actually where our food hub ships to, up and down the I-81 corridor and beyond. But our main like service area is technically Central Appalachia. So we have a lot of programs that go out and beyond that, but that's sort of our main work is focused on Central Appalachia, and we're physically located in southwestern Virginia, although the ASD's agroforestry team is all remote. So we really believe that we have the power to transform Central Appalachia to help out with food access, unemployment, poverty. Our region faces some pretty tough circumstances. 1 in 8 families in our region are food insecure, and the number of farms and farmland acres are in decline. And across the nation, we have some of the highest rates of average poverty, hunger, and unemployment. And here are some ways that we are being change makers and leading the way. We have sold $40 million in produce from local farmers and helped distribute it through our food hub. 150,000 pounds of food grown by new gardeners through our programming. More than 80 raised beds have been installed and managed at schools and clubs. We've helped preserve over 5,000 acres of forest land, helped with over 300 new farm startups through our training and resources, and donated over 7 million pounds of local and regional food donated to area pantries. So really pretty exciting stuff. And the thing we're extra excited about right now is that we have acquired 20 acres between Bristol and Abingdon, Virginia. And we are working on building a destination agricultural campus to serve as a demonstration farm and ag ed campus, and also have a secondary food hub and herb hub. And if you are someone who is in a position to help out, we're always taking donations to help out with that. And it's Giving Tuesday season. We're able to match up to $40,000 one to one. So please consider making a donation. Our agroforestry programs you can find through the drop down on our webpage. There's a lot of resources there. Right now, I want to hype 3 funding opportunities that we're working with. One is the Expanding Agroforestry Project led by the Nature Conservancy. We're also partnered on the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program led by Virginia Tech, and also the Assets Grant Program led by Virginia Tech and Working Trees. And Assets is a program that pairs silvopasture installs with carbon credits. So we've got information about all those on the website if you're in a position to be installing some agroforestry and you're looking for funding. So we also have our agroforestry trainings for natural resources professionals. This is one of the biggest pieces of programming in our agroforestry department. This is basically training focused on people who are in the field doing the work, but feel like they need a little more education, a little more support to get to the point where they can really help landowners. So in particular, these are geared at like NRCS, Department of Forestry, Extension, and there are some online modules that are free associated with this, and you can go to learnagroforestry.com to access those. The Introduction to Agroforestry for Natural Resources Professionals is a free course, as well as the Social Competencies in Agroforestry. So you can get those for free. The rest are pay to play, but it's a very, very cost-effective bundle, and there are many hours of really excellent resources, tutorials, all kinds of great stuff in those courses. So think about those. And the last piece I want to talk about is our Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, which is nested inside our food hub. And we have trainings, cost share, processing, and marketing. We do aggregation work to help small farms come together to be able to access larger orders that typically only a larger farm would be able to access. And we help folks market. We help with teaching folks how to process their herbs, how to grow their herbs. It's really kind of a one-stop shop. So if you are within like 3 hours of the Herb Hub, which is in Duffield, Virginia, so very southwest, if you're within 3 hours of that Herb Hub, we can really help you in your herb business. Last but not least, before we move on to Zach, so our next session is coming up. We've got a little break between these first 3 sessions and the last 2 for this season. So we have Jesse Markson from Yellowbud Farm talking about Yellowbud hickory on Friday the 13th of what month is it? December? Not December yet. It will be December. And the following Monday, we have a nut cooperatives panel with the Asheville Nuttery, New York Tree Crops Alliance, and Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. So really looking forward to those. And first, I'm going to, or actually Sesha is going to send out a poll for the audience to hear what field y'all are in, what you are, what kind of stuff you may be growing. So while you're doing that, let me give you a minute to look at that and focus on that. And then I am going to read Zach's bio. I'll give you a second so that you can focus on his bio first. And so that I can have a sip of tea. Okay, while y'all are doing that, Zach Elfers is a tree crops enthusiast and lifelong student of nature. He operates a small nursery, Future Forest Plants, where he lives in southern York County, Pennsylvania. He seeks opportunities to explore, research, and sometimes even has a little time to write in relation to topics such as ethnobotany, agroecology, and Native American land management, and the legacy and persistence of indigenous landscapes. The hickories, persimmons, and honey locusts have featured mainly in his tree crop exploration, selection, and breeding endeavors. So welcome, Zach. I am going to go ahead and, oh, we still got a couple participants coming in. Okay, I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds, then I'm gonna end this poll and we'll share the results so you can see who we're working with today. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right. Can you all see that? Looks like we've got, Zach, can you see the poll results?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So it looks like we have over 50% farmers, a few NRPs, some researchers, some interested parties, some students. And if you're an other person, or if you just want to share more specificity about yourself, please feel free to do that in the chat. We got some annuals folks, some commodity folks. That's cool. And a lot of perennial and tree crop folks. Excellent. Ooh, a few herb growers. Excellent. So thank you for doing that. It is part of how we track metrics and see who we're reaching. And it also is just useful for us in planning our programming, and it's useful for Zach to know who he's speaking with. So I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go ahead and let Zach get his screen going. And while he's doing that, I will just say thank you so much for being here, Zach.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Emily. And it's exciting to be here and talk about a tree crop species that I care a lot about. I think they're pretty neat. I guess I'll just give a little bit about my background. So I've been in, broadly speaking, horticulture for a number of years now, and that began just as a kid with a passion for gardening and just being in nature, and sort of evolved into organic farming and then permaculture. And I went pretty heavy into native plant propagation in particular. And then that's spun me into agroforestry. So a lot of related tendrils there. But I would say my journey with honey locusts didn't begin really until, I mean, I guess I knew what the trees were, but it didn't really begin until 2016 when I was introduced to the John Hershey nursery, and that was through my friend Max Pascal. Um, there had been an article that came out about it in Permaculture Activist, and I am from the area, the region of southeastern Pennsylvania, so it wasn't far from my home area. And so I went there with him and our friend Dale and a small group of people. We met at the Quaker Meeting House, and sure enough, there were some 90-year-old honey locusts, persimmons, chestnuts, hickories. It really opened my mind to the world of tree crops. And then the follow up to that is in 2018, the Savannah Institute put out a call for a honey locust contest, which was really exciting. Um, and there were a lot of honey locusts at the John Hershey farm. So I actually had a sponsorship through with Max Drawn from Bass Pecan to inventory all the honey locusts at the farm. And I didn't realize this at the time, but they were all your standard Tennessee Valley Authority selections, and they were grafted. But the grafts heal so well in honey locusts that it's really hard to see that. So I didn't know that at the time, but a lot of them are clones. And I'll get into that. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, but basically there were, I sent to SI Savannah Institute like the fleshiest honey locusts from the Hershey farm, and they ended up closing that contest because they didn't receive any material that what didn't exceed the TVA material. So, which is funny and very accurate. So anyway, that really that's where I cut my teeth on really taking a close look at honey locusts. And here we are 6 years later, and that hasn't stopped. So I'm going to talk about honey locusts today. It's quite an amazing tree. There's a nice picture here on the left of an old growth tree in Tennessee. And every story has to start at the beginning. So when I start at the beginning, I like to go back to geology and evolution. So if we can rewind the clock over 16 million years ago during the Miocene era, the continents were positioned differently than they are today. So there was a supercontinent in the northern hemisphere known as Laurasia, and that was the Laurentide cradon. Basically, it was North America, Europe, and Asia all together. So that the mid-Atlantic, the rift in the Atlantic Ocean hadn't fully split apart at that time. So there's a lot of species where you'll notice, like chestnuts, for example, there's Asian chestnuts and there's North American chestnuts and there's European chestnuts. So these were all once united in the times of Laurasia. And the continents split apart about 16 million years ago, give or take. And that is when a lot of diversification happened and all that. So the honey locust is in the bean family. It's actually in the peacock flower subfamily, and there's 12 species worldwide. So most of them are centered in Eastern Asia. So that's presumed to be the genus's origin place. But we do have two species in North America. We've got the honey locust and the water locust, which is Gladitia aquatica. And there's also a naturalized hybrid between the two in North America. There is actually some honey locust in the Caucasus Mountains in the Near East and kind of Central Asia area. But these disparate populations, they lost connection 16 million years ago. And the reason for that split is geological. So if we go back to that era in Earth's history, there were a lot more megafauna than there are today. There were woolly mammoths, there were mastodons, and the honey locust is notorious for its thorns. Actually, the Gladitia triacanthos means three-parted thorns. Now, woolly mammoths and mastodons are very similar, but there's key differences between the two. So I just want to go over these megafaunal interactions real quick because it's pretty neat. The obvious thing is that the woolly mammoths were much bigger than the mastodons. But crucially, they had a different habitat, and that's what reflected the differences. So the woolly mammoths had very large, low, swooping tusks, which would actually clear. They were browsers. I'm sorry, not browsers, grazers. They ate from grassland ecosystems primarily, and so they would use those tusks to push the snow away, to uncover the grass under the snow. And this is actually where the permafrost was created. However, the mastodon, they were primarily browsers, so they ate tree leaves, and their tusks were shorter and more straight to help them to push trees over and to eat the foliage. So honey locust evolved in this context, and that's what the thorns are for. They're basically to deter elephants. So pretty gnarly. Sadly, we lost the mastodon, but we still have the honey locust trees. Now, another cool megafaunal interaction relates to the pod dispersal, but I just want to get into the pods real quick. The reason why honey locust is such a desirable tree in agroforestry these days is because of the pods, which some cultivars can be up to 40% sugar by dry weight. They're rich in protein, mostly in the seeds. They've got a lot of fiber and some other elements in there. You can see on the right how fleshy it is. So that's where the name of the tree comes from. It's kind of an amber honey-colored goo. Before it's ripe, it's neon green, but it ripens to that amber color. And it's hypothesized that the pods evolved in relationship with megafauna such as giant ground sloths, which wouldn't have been destructive to trees necessarily, but they would have been large and they would reach up into the canopy and eat the fruits. I think persimmons or pawpaws and some other Kentucky coffee tree and other species are thought to have been dispersed by giant ground sloths. Kentucky coffee tree, incidentally, is a sister genus to honey locust. And then after the megafauna went extinct, there's a rich history of indigenous usage and relationship with the honey locust tree, among others. So in the South, it was used as a sugar tree. It was a medicinal plant. There are several place names in the South that are named for honey locust. I think the most prominent one would probably be the Kulisaja River, which is in western North Carolina. It's Hernando de Soto went through that area, but Kulisaja essentially means sugar town or honey locust place. And still today, you can find a lot of honey locust in association with native settlements all the way up into New York, possibly into Maine, well outside of its core region of range. And so these would have, it's clearly a tree used in Native American agroforestry and valued. Interest in honey locust among those of us who colonized this continent didn't really begin in earnest until the 20th century. Although George Washington and Thomas Jefferson did plant honey locust trees, so fun little history there. But it was largely brought to attention by J. Russell Smith in the first publication of Tree Crops, which was in 1929. Shortly after that, the Tennessee Valley Authority was formed under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and Tree Crops Division was created, which eventually John Hershey would lead that in 1934. And what they did is they sponsored a lot of contests, and they were able to make some nice selections, which are still today the main selections that we have to work with. So this would be primarily Millwood and Calhoun. Actually, J. Russell Smith did sponsor a honey locust contest earlier in the 20s. But after World War II, the direction of things changed. There was less interest in honey locusts. The Soil Conservation Service worked with them for a little bit, and there was some renewed interest in the 80s, but it's been pretty quiet since then. So in the modern agroforestry context, it's mostly considered as a silvopasture tree for supplemental livestock feed, winter forage, and the like. Although it is edible for humans, it's delicious and can be turned into value-added products for human consumption, and that's something we'll get at. So basically, we went from these pods and thorns as evolutionary anachronisms to now a wonderful stockpile tree. So these pods, which are really rich in sugar and fiber and protein, they tend to drop later in the season. So usually by late October into November, they begin to fall out of the tree, and they can continue doing that into February or March, depending on conditions. And this is a crucial time of year where the forage grasses aren't growing as much. There's less forage available on the landscape. And so this is kind of a crucial late season forage that covers that late window. And it's also desirable for silvopasture because of the dappled shade that its canopy casts. So being in the bean family, it's got these pinnately compound leaves that let a lot of light through. And they're quite attractive, which is one of the reasons why honey locust has become such a common street tree today too. Now, how this favors silvopasture is the dappled shade is enough to create a cooler, moister, shady microclimate, which is a refuge for the animals in the heat of the sun, especially in the summer. But it's not a heavy enough shade to outcompete the grasses, and it will actually promote the growth of cool season grasses later into the season, later into the summer. Also, that cooler microclimate can tend to hold more moisture, so it can promote growth in that way. So it really fits really well into a grassland ecosystem. It's a savanna tree would be kind of its main habitat. Well, you will find it in old growth forests. It really thrives in that zone of middle succession, mid succession. Sometimes as a pioneering species, but definitely in more thickety, brushy environments. Here's a picture from Fiddle Creek Dairy in Lancaster County, photo credit from Austin Unruh. He's done a lot of work establishing silvopasture in my home state. I'm actually working on a Trees for Grazers project this week in Center County, and we're establishing lots and lots of honey locusts on a very beautiful farm. So it's exciting to see this work happening. So I just want to give a shout out to Austin at Trees for Grazers. He's a great resource. So as I mentioned, it's a great late season stockpile. You can see how these pods just totally cover the ground in at the end of the year. There's various estimates on how productive honey locust trees are, but it seems reasonable that a mature tree can produce about 200 pounds of pods, and you can stock an acre with something like 20 to 30 mature trees. So, we're talking potentially 4 to 6,000 pounds of food when they produce. Now, there's some caveats to that. You got to take everything with a grain of salt. Our ideal scenarios don't always work as well in actuality. And one thing to be aware of too is that honey locust is often biennial in its bearing habit, so it generally won't bear every single year. But it is incredibly productive. The pods can also be processed for human food. Here's an example of just a basic recipe. You can chop the pods into 1 to 2 inch slices, cover them with water, bring to a boil it vigorously for a while, and then you can strain the pulp through cheesecloth, and that will expel the water, which takes the tannic acid out with it, whatever tannic acid may be in there, and leaves behind a puree, which is rather like applesauce or almost like banana pudding. It's got a very unique flavor that's quite delicious. You can also dry the pods whole, and you can grind them into a carob-like powder, which is great for baking. It would be really good for cutting chocolate. And there was a guy, Robert Schofer, who made a selection of honey locust in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania, and he operated a bakery in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he was using honey locusts for his bakery. So this has been done before.
Zach, I'm just going to give you a little
Let's
5 minute warning.
see. Sure. So it's considered a polygamma-dioecious plant, which is kind of a complicated word for it has male flowers and female flowers that are generally separate but can be on the same plant. So the male flowers look like this. Those are the staminate flowers, and then the pistillate or female flowers look like that. And that tongue in the middle, the pistil, that will actually develop into the honey locust pod. Honey locusts are parthenocarpic, so they'll bear pods regardless of whether they're being pollinized by another flower. So they're like chickens. They'll lay eggs no matter what, but if there's no rooster around, the eggs won't be fertile. It's the same with honey locusts. They'll produce the pods no matter what, but without pollinizer, you won't have seeds in the pod. Let's see. So breeding. So one of my interests moving forward is to actually breed honey locusts, because there are some needs that we need to enable more widespread adoption of honey locust and silvopasture. The thorns can be problematic, but the fleshiness of the pods is what's so desirable. So wouldn't it be great if we had a population of fleshy and thorny honey locusts? Honey locusts have generally propagated through grafting. It's like my slides got a little bit out of order here. I want to go over the propagation. So the thorny honey locust trees, they're generally thorny on the trunk, and then the thorns are sparser in the lower branches and generally absent from the crown canopy and those the tips of those twigs. And so if you gather scionwood from high in the canopy and you graft that, whatever hormonal or epigenetic memory is in those twigs, it'll continue to grow entirely thornless. So, for example, Calhoun honey locust, which is the fleshiest one we have right now at almost 40% sugar, that came from an original tree that was very thorny. But through grafting, we can grow it in a pasture setting, for example, where it's entirely thornless. The thornlessness is desirable because the thorns can pop tractor tires, for instance. Um, One of the problems this poses, however, is that genetically it's still a thorny tree. So when those pods are produced, when the animals eat the pods, new trees start to come up in the pasture, and many of those might have thorns. And so this is where the breeding comes into play, where we want to create a population of fleshy and thorny honey locusts. Mostly what this looks like for me at the moment anyway is just planting out large numbers of seedlings and then having a heavy culling protocol. But I want to get into some of the broader picture issues with honey locust. It can be coppiced quite readily, so it can be cut down in winter and it will resprout from the roots. You can get saw logs from it, from timber, for firewood, for whatever. It's quite desirable from a woodworking standpoint. It's doesn't have the rot resistance of black locust, but it does have a really beautiful brown colored wood with really nice grain. But for the most part, the trees are, I mean, they're pretty hardy as nails. There's no real significant management issues I've run into in terms of like pest and disease and things like that. They seem to do all right on dry, rocky slopes, on rich alluvial bottomlands, and fertile, well-drained soils, even on the edge of marshes and swamps and things like that, and everywhere in between. So they're pretty dang versatile, which is what you want to see for an agroforestry tree. Um, there is the seed weevil. They can bear in about 3 years with heavy fertilization. That's the earliest I've ever heard of, but I would say 5 to 7 is more realistic. So there's let's see. I wanted to talk about the pods. I seem to have missed that slide. Anyway, so exploration here is one of the things I've been up to. A lot of it's just dumb luck, having like the knowledge base to know where to look, where to go. I'll give a shout out to Mike Gold here. I see he was in the chat. He did a project at University of Michigan, I believe, where he collected honey locust seeds from all across the range of the species and planted them all out in one grove. And I guess that was back in the 80s. And so my friend Alex Tanky and I went there a few years ago, and we made a selection there called Monroe, and that came from a seed provenance from Monroe County, Arkansas, and it's been tested at 35% sugar by dry weight. So anybody who went to the grove would have found that tree, but we just happen to know where to go. So, most of it's dumb luck, but experience is part of it. There are honey locust trees, for example, at the bottom of Lake Owasco, where there was a Iroquoian settlement there that was important anthropologically. There are honey locust trees along the Conococheque, which follows the Tuscarora Path. So there's definitely a clear association there with Native American settlements. I have some pictures of pods here. So there's basically or 4 or 5 main classic cultivars. So there's millwood, Calhoun, Hershey, Ashworth, and Schofer. So millwood came from a tree that was originally thornless. So it's perhaps going to create more thornless seedlings than Calhoun per se, who came from a thorny tree. Millwood's been tested around 31% sugar, but I think there's been some testings ranging up to 33, 34, 35% sugar. Calhoun has ranged from like 35% sugar to 41% sugar. A lot of this depends on soil fertility, depends on climate, depends on solar access. So it's sort of like the genetic potential is set, but it won't be met unless the conditions are there. The Hershey cultivar came from John Hershey and his nursery in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. That one, I don't know if the original tree was thornless or thorny, if that came from his breeding or if that was something he found. J. Russell Smith also had a selection. It's just called Smith. I haven't been able to track that one down. I don't know if it still exists in cultivation anyway. There's probably a relic tree of it somewhere that it would be a worthwhile endeavor for someone to identify that. Ashworth comes from Fred Ashworth, who was the first owner of St. Lawrence Nurseries, which is way up there in New York, near the border with Canada. It's near the Adirondacks, so it's like a Zone 3 or Zone 4 region. And Ashworth Honey Locust is said to come from New York. It was tested by Auburn University in the 40s. So presumably it's one of the more cold hardy selections that we have. Schofer, that came from Richard Schofer from Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. I was actually able to track that one down last year through my connection with Andy Wilson, who did a lot with honey locusts back in the 80s. Here's some pictures of the pods. I want to move quickly because we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A here. But there's been some more cultivars that have been introduced lately in the last few years. Cooper from Taylor Malone, that one seems very promising. The original tree was mostly thornless, maybe like a 2 on a scale of thornlessness from 1 to 10. It's pretty fleshy, and it seems to bear semi-annually. Marguerite, that came from Hector Black of Hidden Springs Nursery in Kentucky. Monroe, that's the one I mentioned earlier from Alex Tanke and I, from Mike Gold's work. Piat is another one from that grove. Pool Forge is one of Austin Unruh's selections. That one has 28% sugar, so it's side by side to a TVA selection like Calhoun or Millwood. It seems much less impressive, but from a silvopasture standpoint, it's still great forage for the animals, and that one is semi-annual in its bearing habits too. Trotter is another one of his selections. Taylor Malone and Eliza Greenman have recently discovered a bunch more. I want to talk about Big Fatty real quick. I'm not over 90% certain that that's just Calhoun that got renamed. So as I mentioned with like my original introduction to honey locusts, it was like exploring the remnant trees at John Hershey's farm. And, I found the one that was the fleshiest of all the trees there and couldn't see a graft scar. And, I'd never seen like a comparative sample of Calhoun to compare it to anything to. And, so I showed it to Buzz Ferber, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's Big Fatty," So the name stuck, and it's been grafted for several years now. But I'm pretty sure it's just Calhoun. So Calhoun is a really nice tree in that it's semi-annual. I say semi because it doesn't create a heavy crop every single year. It will have a heavy crop followed by a light crop, followed by a moderate crop, followed by a light crop, followed by a heavy crop, things like that. So it's a little bit more inconsistent. I mean, it's consistent in the sense that it bears every year, but inconsistent in terms of overall productivity. Whereas some variety like Millwood may be strongly biennial, where it has off years where it doesn't produce anything at all. But when it does produce, it's more consistent. So it's good to have those two in a pasture. And a lot of the old plantings worked almost exclusively with just Millwood and Calhoun. Virginia Tech has a program down there. They've got an orchard of I believe it's just millwood honey locusts, and they've been grazing sheep there. I believe John Fike is in charge of that program now. Another thing to mention here is that the sheep can digest the seeds of honey locust, but cows can't digest them, so they'll just pass whole through the system of a cow, whereas the sheep will. I guess my understanding is that they'll destroy the seeds as they eat them, so they'll get those nutrients, which from a management standpoint is a good thing to know because it means you'll in a sheep pasture you'll have fewer honey locust seedlings sprouting up. These are some of the cultivars that I've introduced, and there's a bunch more coming. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop there and open the floor to Q&A. I have a few more slides we could cover there.
Oh, thanks so much, Zach. Do you want to keep your slides up to be able to reference that material, or do you want to um, go back to just your lovely face? You have a preference?
Why don't we stop sharing? And if a slide comes up, I can bring it up.
All right, sounds good. And I can tell we have a little bit of a delay on our end, so sorry for that, folks, but we're gonna roll through it. So as a reminder, we're moving into the Q&A. The first bit of this is going to be questions that we have seen ahead of time. So I'm going to go ahead and facilitate those now, and then we'll move into the Q&A that y'all are submitting live. And once we get to that point, if anyone wants to like actually do a little hand raise and ask a question with your real actual voice instead of your keyboard, you're welcome to do that too. But before we get into that, we're going to do our little quick fire round. I'm going to only ask one question, and I'll give a little background on this. But I met Zach at the Northern Nut Growers Association this year, which was an incredible gathering. It totally blew my mind. And since then he's connected me to a farm out here that he mentioned in his presentation, and we've both been helping out over there with their tree crops a little bit. But I recently had Zach over for dinner, and after he left, my husband was like, "Whose shoes are these?" Like 3 days later, and I was like, I guess they're Zach's. Like, who leaves without their shoes? And then I met someone else recently who was a mutual acquaintance. And I was like, oh, yeah, he's been working a little bit at this farm down the road. And he came over for dinner. And I think it was John at Trees for Grazers who was like, was he wearing shoes? So I got to know. What are, for someone who obviously doesn't enjoy wearing shoes. Although when I've met you, you were wearing shoes because we were working in poison ivy and blackberry. But for a shoe hater, what's your favorite farm shoe?
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I wear Crocs. I have no shame. They're like the perfect farm shoe. You can get them wet. You don't have to worry about mud. You don't have to worry about water. They're lightweight. You can slip in and out of them. They're protective enough that you can step on brambles and stuff.
Yeah. Well, you must have multiple pairs because there's still a pair at my house.
I
Um,
do.
that's how much he loves them, people. All right. So you've tackled thornless versus honey, or versus honey thornless, thorny versus thornless already to an extent, but someone submitted a specific question about uh, thornless reverting to thorny under stress, particularly from grazing stress. So if there's anything else in the thorny realm you'd like to discuss, and particularly that whole one reverting to the other, please share.
Yeah, that's a great question. There definitely is a relationship between thorniness and stress response. I've seen, for example, there are grafted honey locust trees. These are mature old trees that are growing entirely thornless because they're grafted. but there's a burl on one of those trees and it pushes thorns out of that burl. Supposedly they don't regrow if you cut them off. I think we have cut those thorns off and they may have regrown. So, that's a data point that needs some follow up. But if you look at the tree's life cycle, like a thorny honey locust, for example, I mean, if it's genetically thornless, it's going to be thornless the whole time from day one. But the thorny ones, so first of all, thorniness is a spectrum from 1 to 10. Now, admittedly, this is a bit subjective. We need to come up with more objective like metrics for grading that, maybe like counting the thorns per node or something like that. But when I see a honey locust, I just think, okay, is this a 1 or is it a 10? 1 is entirely thornless, 10 is like severely thorned. And most are going to end up somewhere in the middle, somewhere between like, well, actually, the thornless ones tend to be completely thornless. It's more rare to find one with like very, very occasional thorns. But most of the trees are going to be somewhere in the middle. And the thorny ones might be like a 5 or 6 on the scale. So because I have a nursery and I grow a lot of honey locust seedlings, I can see right away the ones that are coming out with thorns as a young seedling. I know that those are going to be very high on the spectrum of thorniness. Whereas there's a whole host of seedlings that will be thornless for the first year, sometimes for the second year, sometimes for the third year. And when I was new to honey locust and more naive, I would see the thornless ones in the seedling bed and just think, okay, this is a thornless tree. It's always going to be thornless, but they will push out thorns sometimes in year 2, in year 3, in year 4, and that's related to where they are on the scale of thorniness. So, for example, something that's a 4 or a 5 on the thorniness scale might not push out a thorn until year 3 or 4, whereas something that's an 8 or a 9 on the scale might push out a thorn in year 1 or year 2. If you've got a seedling that's gone 5 or 6 years without thorns, you can be pretty confident that that's going to be, if not entirely thornless, it's going to be so mildly thorny as to not really count. And the way they grow with all the thorns on the trunk, but then it peters out into the canopy, you would think that that is like a hormonal response. And hormones are modulated by stress. So yeah, I do think there is something to that. But like with many things, especially with agroforestry and all the renewed interest in this, we need more data. We just need to compare notes more. We need to talk more. We need to record more. And hopefully these questions will be answered more definitively.
Fair enough. All right. So growing conditions. How can growing conditions affect pod size specifically, or other characteristics, I suppose?
Well, there are trees that I know of that are overcrowded, so they have larger trees growing next to them, or they're spaced too tightly with other trees, and they'll produce that they're grafted cultivar honey locusts. The pods will be the proper length, the proper width, but they will never quite fill. They'll be pretty thin and papery, and so there must be some kind of relationship there with photosynthesis, which goes without saying, but probably a nutritional thing in the soil. So the more fertility they can get, the happier they'll be.
Great. So I have a question about tree spacing. I suppose there's probably a split here, like silvopasture tree spacing versus maybe other application tree spacing, um, perhaps an orchard or. But do you want to touch in on that? I know silvopasture isn't like your passion,
Sure.
but
So the form of the tree, it's not it doesn't want to be as spreading as an oak, but it's not quite as upright as a shagbark hickory. So they're sort of in the middle there. So you could get away with probably 25-foot centers on a final spacing with like big mature trees. Um, I think that would be okay in like a silvopasture context, especially if you plan to like cull any trees in the future. Um, you could do like 15-foot centers down the rows, something like that, and maybe like 40 feet in between the rows. Um, I think a lot of it depends on what you're going for. You might have a situation where you just want single rows of honey locust instead of like a dense block planting. Um, and of course, depends on how much space you've got. If you've got plenty of space, may as well let them breathe. If you're short on space, plant them more densely, plan to call if you have to.
Awesome. Um, so this next question is about nitrogen fixation, and you kind of hear people getting into arguments about this. I'm curious what your take is on honey locust and nitrogen fixation.
From what I've read, it's pretty mixed. Some people saying it doesn't seem to fix nitrogen at all. It doesn't seem to form rhizobial connections in the roots, but even that is mixed. Some people claim that they have found some rhizobia. Other people claim that it does fix nitrogen, but it seems to be by a different metabolic pathway. Um, because it is in the bean family, my intuition says I think it's a little unlikely that it doesn't fix nitrogen at all, but it doesn't
Mhm.
seem to be a very good nitrogen fixer, mild at best.
So I know part of your kind of passion around the honey locust is the idea of honey locust as a human food crop. So what, like in an ideal world, what place would you like the honey locust to fill, within the human diet? What's the big potential you see there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess my thoughts are evolving on that. As I've mentioned before, like the honey locust powder, it's a lot like carob powder. So it'd be good for cutting chocolate. It'd be good for baking. Um, and neither of those things are really my forte. The pulp, I mean, has a lot of sugar and it's flavorful, but I mostly see it as an additive. I don't see
Mhm.
too many contexts where it would be a pure food standing alone.
Sure. Were those pictures yours? The chopping and boiling and applesaucing?
Yes.
Excellent. Do you do that frequently? Like, is that something you've started to work into your diet more?
Well, when I process the honey locust seed, it just seems like such a waste to leave the flesh. So, I try to make something with it. The ideal setup for me would be to dry the pods on like a mass level, like if I had a nice greenhouse or something where I could lay them out until they're thoroughly dry and then grind them into powder. That would
Mm,
be my go-to processing method.
cool.
And when I do that, I keep the seeds separate. So I hold on to those for propagation.
Sure. So, okay, and then lastly, you talked about a little bit about your introduction into honey locust, but how did you get started into fruit exploration and forest exploration in general? And I think there's a lot of people, like you've said a couple times, like we need more data. Half of this is just luck, half of it's or 90% of this is luck. Some percentage of this is just, conversations. I think there's a lot of people out there that would love to see like what you're doing and say, "Oh man, I'm really passionate about this tree or this shrub or this avenue. How do I do what he's doing?" You've managed to really sort of you've taken this passion of yours and like nerd it out until it became like a side hustle, until it became like a real hustle, and now like this is your work and this is your life. So what like I I hear people asking me that, and I don't. I feel like you're living it, and I would like to hear your perspective on that. How do people get started?
It's a tough question to answer. I mean, a lot of it is like right place at the right time, kind of accidental happenstance. I mean, like I mentioned with my introduction to the Hershey nursery, I just happened to live 40 minutes away from it, so it was pretty much in my backyard. Um, and you'll see that not just with like the tree crops community, but with lots of industries. Like if, for example, if cars are manufactured in Detroit, you tend to have more people in that area doing that kind of thing. So one thing you could look for is where those communities are, where those people are, and I've always just tried to make myself as sponge-like as possible. So I just try to pay attention and to listen and to remember and um, put pieces together. And I think that the best advice I would offer is just to follow your passion. Follow the tree or species that interests you. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have commercial potential or it doesn't have that yet, or if other people aren't as hip to it. It's got to start somewhere, and that's the best motivation for me. And once you get into a world, more doors open up and more possibilities open up.
Are there any organizations or conferences or anything like that that you'd like to like hype or uplift for people who are, sort of starting out in this type of work?
Yeah, definitely NAFEX, the North American Fruit Explorers. They release a quarterly journal called Pomona, or maybe it's an annual journal. Emily was talking about how we met at the Northern Nut Growers Conference. That's another great community of like-minded people. There's a lot of good stuff happening on the internet too. There's some really cool Facebook groups for different trees of interest. So there's like a Facebook group for hickories and hickory growers. There's one for chestnuts, for persimmons. So the organization was NAFEX, NAFEX. Yeah, and other things on social media. Often you can find the people who are doing things that resonate with your interests, and I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, well, and it's accessible to everybody too. Everybody can hop online and get on Facebook. There's no paywall there.
Totally.
Um, okay, so we're gonna move into the live Q&A in just a minute. So I see we've got I think 6 questions in there, but feel free to pile a bunch more on. And we can also, if we have time at the end, we can revisit some of those slides, Zach, at the end of your presentation. But first of all, if you were a honey locust, what would you be like? What on a scale of 1 to 10, how thorny and maybe some other characteristics? Tell us about your pods.
I had a dream once where I found these honey locust pods that were like this big and like that, like comically huge.
Yeah.
And I mean, if yeah, I would be that tree.
Thorny or thornless?
I'd be thornless.
Yeah. You're so agreeable. What's your favorite, what are some of your favorite tools for the work that you do?
I mean, tools in general. I mean,
Mhm.
well, I
Anything.
don't know how I would do anything. I don't know how I do anything without a tree spade, but I really like the broad fork. I think it's an incredible tool, and that's kind of my main bed building tool and sod breaking tool. Um, yeah.
Nice. Do you have a favorite type of broad fork? Do you like the slicer or the dowels?
Actually, my friend Wilson Alvarez designed one that Ben Weiss manufactures under the name Rebel Garden Tools. So it's like
Oh
a
yeah.
big stainless, not stainless, steel. It's a steel broad fork that has the handles come off. They've got cautery pins at the bottom, and it's got like a rocker arm on the bottom, so you can use it, pry up against the ground with it. And it's got, I think, 19 or 21-inch tines, something like that. It's
Nice.
pretty beefy.
Yeah. Sounds like it. It's really. Say the name of that again. Rebel Tools, is that what it is?
Rebel Garden Tools.
Garden Tool. And that's a .com, isn't it? I feel like I've been on that website. Someone can find
I
it
don't
and
know
put
if it's
that
a
in the chat for
.com.
us.
I
Someone
would
will
do it
figure it
for
out.
yeah, for sure.
And what was the last song that was stuck in your head? I always ask people this question. It's my favorite.
Oh, I don't know. It might have been Christmas song.
I don't doubt it this time of year. All right, I'm going to open up the Q&A. All right, so we have from Colin, besides uses as forage for animals, what are, if any, the most common uses for humans? So we talked about that a little bit, but is there more that you'd like to say on that?
Um, well, the pods are actually quite good just eaten off the tree, off the
Mm,
ground. There's a funny ethnobotany reference. It's in the Chiltowski Cherokee ethnobotany book, Nancy Chiltowski, and I think that it's something like honey locust pods were given to children to appease them when they were having like fits, I guess. So you read between the lines, and they're basically being given to kids as candy. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, so they're quite good, especially the really fleshy ones. They have kind of like an apple cider flavor, so I think
Mhm.
they're really good for brewing. That's one thing that I should have mentioned earlier. There's tons of old Appalachian recipes for like honey locust hooch and moonshine and stuff like that. Because of the high sugar content, it ferments really well. I've heard of recipes where you like layer honey locust pods with persimmons, with honey locust pods with persimmons, and make an alcohol there in that way. Um, yeah, other ways that humans can use the tree. I mean, the in the past, the thorns have had use as like fish hooks and sewing needles and things like that, which isn't really relevant these days. But yeah, that's a good question.
I have a
There
question
might be
about
some medicinal use of the tree that hasn't been tapped yet.
I have a question about when you're talking about processing them like for a carob powder, is that is it just straight up like drying and grinding, like it's the gooey part, it's the outside, it's the whole thing minus the
Yep,
seeds?
whole thing.
Okay, so it's not
Mhm.
there's not like a separation of like the rib full of goo versus the rest of it.
Nope.
Okay, cool. All right, from Doug, curious to hear if any cultivars have a tendency to bear pods annually. And again, I know you touched in on this, but I also know you had a lot more slides about cultivars.
Yeah, so Calhoun is the most well-known one that is, if not fully annual, at least semi-annual, tends to make crops of various sizes year after year. It's also not unknown to miss a year. So if you're observing the tree for 7 years, it might not make any pods one of those years, but it's generally annual. Um, so in the pecan industry, Taylor Malone actually turned me onto this thinking. In the pecan industry, when they look for a tree that's annually bearing, they count clusters of nuts, or they count the nuts per cluster rather. So um, trees that have more nuts per cluster tend to be more biennial. Obviously, trees that only have one nut per cluster aren't productive enough to make it. So I think the pecan breeders are looking for like 3 to 4 nuts per cluster. And that can translate to annual bearing. The bigger picture in this story is that bearing habits are a function of metabolics. And I think there's been a little bit of misinformation out there in just the world of forestry in general with this idea that trees mast according to certain like chemical signals or timing signals and things like that. I think a lot of it is just metabolics. So, for example, the white oak has the capability of bearing every single year, but if it's a drought year or if it's too too much instability during the season, it isn't able to ripen its crop every single year. Whereas with a red oak, it's setting the acorns that are going to the 1 year, and then those will actually overwinter, and then they'll develop fully the following year. So it's a 2 year cycle, and it can have dormant acorns and actively developing acorns within the same year on the same tree. So if everything goes right, climatologically and with fertility to the tree, it can bear every year. But generally, we don't see that. Um, there's been some studies on metabolics and productivity with chestnuts, and they've come to the conclusions that I'm echoing here, that basically if the tree gets enough fertility, if it gets enough nutrition, it'll bear every year. If it's deficit somewhere, whether that's from the climate or from the fertility, the tree has to catch up and it has to rest. And this is what causes that biennial cycle. So with bearing and honey locusts, I would again, we need more data. I would start counting the pods per cluster on the trees and see if there's a correlation there between annual bearing and the number there. And then it'd be great to do some controlled crosses between trees that show propensity for annual bearing, such as like Cooper and Pool Forge with Calhoun and Monroe and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one from Colin. When you're out fruit exploring and you find native groves of exceptional trees, does this normally signify indigenous planting or cultivation? Have you found some of these locations and propagated seeds?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Not as much with honey locust, although there's like some promising areas I'm trying to follow up with. Um, but definitely with hickories. I mean, it's like night and day, and that's like a whole nother conversation. I mean, my opinion, which I think I have evidence to back, is that hickory is basically a domesticated species. At least certain strains of it that are in association with native settlements. I mean, what was happening on this continent 400 and 500 years ago is hard to comprehend through the way we manage land today. There were whole swaths of the eastern temperate forest region that were quite meticulously managed. Now, I'm not suggesting like native people were planting every single tree and selecting every single tree, but over hundreds of generations with larger landscape selections and things like that, you basically ended up with a gene pool that was, for lack of a better word, domesticated.
Okay. All right. And it looks like Mike Gold already weighed in on this, but from Bree, she said, I may have just missed it, but what is the average lifespan of a healthy tree? Is there anything you want to say about life expectancy?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. The slide from the opening slide from my presentation was an old growth honey locust in Tennessee, and a tree like that is probably upwards of 200 years old. The ones at the Hershey farm are 90 years old. They're doing just fine. I know some other um, heritage farms with honey locusts of a similar age, and they're totally fine, totally healthy. I'd say they're probably not even halfway through their lifespan. So I think 200 years conservatively is a reasonable estimate.
Awesome. Yeah, Mike's answer was he said they can easily live to 100. So I think that supports what you're saying. All right, from Don, I might have missed it, but what are they being grafted onto? Is there work being done on the rootstock for, say, faster yield or annual bearing or disease issues?
Yeah, great question. They're being grafted to honey locusts, so just straight species. It doesn't really matter whether they're cultivar seedlings or just seedlings that you would get from a big nursery. They seem to take just fine. However, I got to put an asterisk there because when I talked to Andy Wilson, he shares a story of how he grafted a millwood tree to random understock. And I guess after a few years, it kind of like struggled and died. And he had somebody come out who looked at it and they thought that there could have been some kind of graft incompatibility happening there. So, that's something to be aware of. Definitely not as severe as like delayed graft failure in chestnuts or anything like that. But when in doubt, grow out the seedlings of the cultivar you want to graft and graft to the most vigorous ones there. As far as disease resistance goes, I'm not aware of any significant diseases of honey locust. Maybe I'm sure Mike Gold knows much more about that. Um, so it hasn't been a concern of mine, but it is, it's always something to be aware of.
Wonderful. Thank you. Uh, Ruben says, you mentioned sheep will eat and fully digest the seeds, but cows will eat and pass the seeds on in their scat. Is that because the sheep more thoroughly chew the seeds or something else? How well do other ruminants like goats work in honey locust silvopasture? And do honey locusts have any potential for poultry silvopasture? So that was three questions. If you're like me, auditory processing isn't always like automatic. So let me read the first one and we can go through one at a time. Um, do sheep more thoroughly chew the seeds, or is it something else?
I mean, some of this is a little bit outside of my experience. I'm not a grazer, so I can't get into the details of like how the digestive tracts are different or the teeth are different in these animals. I'll leave that question, defer to somebody else on it. And then what was the second part of the question?
How
Oh,
well do?
goats and
Yep.
yeah. I mean, goats seem to eat anything. I can't imagine they would ever have an issue with honey locust. I don't know of any projects that have been like a goat honey locust silvopasture. I'm sure somebody's doing it out there. I'm just not aware of it. As far as chickens go, I think that they would love to peck at those pods and eat the sugar. They might leave the seeds alone. They might eat them. I don't know, but they'll definitely peck at the pods. Like, yeah.
Hmm. Okay,
I
Luca.
wouldn't use honey locust as the primary tree crop for feeding chickens, but if it's part of like an overall system, it's great.
Yeah. Do you know of any practical setup or research being done on living fences to deter deer using tightly spaced honey locust, for example, as a impenetrable hedgerow?
Are you talking about like thorny honey locust specifically,
That's a good
or just
question.
honey
I was
locust
just
generally?
wondering that, and if
I was
Luca
thinking
wants
Osage
to.
orange.
Right, right. If Luca, if you want to either raise a hand and I'll unmute you, or if you just want to tap an amendment to that question, we'll skip to this next question while we wait for Luca to weigh in. But Ryan asks, are there any poisonous lookalikes?
Poisonous lookalikes, not really. Um, not in our region anyway. I mean,
Um,
black locust are they're they're not poisonous, first of all, and the pods are so dramatically different in size. It'd be hard to confuse the two.
mhm. Luca, I clicked allow to
I
talk
can
on your
just
name. So if you wanna comment, feel free. But go ahead, Zach.
I could just answer the question in terms of both, I guess. I'll just assume he's talking about thorny honey locust because I just don't think it would be as much of a deterrent if it's thornless honey locust. You'd have to plant them like really, really close to keep anything away. Um, if they were thorny, I mean the tree has that defense mechanism for a reason. I've wondered myself, like for a silvopasture context, what if you just planted thorny honey locust, didn't worry about tree tubes or electrification or anything like that, and just let them go? I mean, that'll keep the cows away. Um, and yeah, I mean that would be, I think, a perfectly viable system. You just have to be aware of how you're going to manage it, how you're going to keep your tractor wheels intact, or maybe you're not using a tractor for a system like that. So there's all kinds of possibilities, and there's no reason to completely write off the thorny trait.
And I saw that Luca did unmute, so I'll give you a second if you want to pop on, but otherwise we'll just keep going.
Hey there. Yeah, I was asking about the thorny honey locust because the Osage isn't native to New England. So I'm looking for native alternatives. And tractors aren't an issue, and it's not keeping cows in, it's keeping deer out.
Yeah, I'd probably plant them about 3 feet apart, and I'm sure it'll work. I mean, the trees will still need some protection until they're 6 or 7 feet high. But once they're basically large enough to be safe from deer. The thorns will handle the rest.
Nice. Thank you. And thanks for popping on, Luca. Also, I noticed in the chat that Doug responded that regarding sheep eating pods, my experience is that they are crunching seeds intentionally. So they must just be yummy. All right. Alan says, I apologize that I am late. So sorry if you already discussed this. What are some good guild plantings that go with honey locust, especially in silvopasture? So animal safe.
Well, when I hear that question, I think of like the native ecology and context of honey locust. As I mentioned before, while it can grow on like dry, rocky ridges, I think it really thrives in the bottomlands, like in the rich alluvial floodplain areas, and especially in association with like native sites. That's how I've seen it. Like there's areas where, like in the mountains of Pennsylvania, you've got the Ridge Mountains, and there'll be northern hardwood forests where you've got like maples and birches and hemlocks and stuff, and then you get down to the floodplain in the valley, and it's just this jarring transition, and suddenly there's shellbark hickory, there's pawpaw, there's persimmon, there's honey locust, all this stuff continuing. I attribute that to the legacy of indigenous management. But then if you think about, what is that ecological context, those rich bottomlands, that would be what we call like the Appalachian Cove forest. It would be a really good environment for spring ephemerals. It would be a really good environment for growing anything, really. I mean, the fertile valleys is where we do agriculture for the most part today, if you can get that land anyhow. So yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I think you could plant almost anything. It depends not so much on the honey locust tree, but on the soil, I guess.
All right.
I don't think I answered that question very well.
I think you answered it just fine. I think looking at those patterns makes a lot of sense for that question. So from Colin, what are your choice tools, materials, methods for grafting honey locust?
Yeah, great question. I wanted to hit on that. I use bench grafting. I use the Z graft method. It's kind of like a modified whip and tongue graft. I just find it a lot faster and easier, and it's really good for sizing different pieces of scion wood together. So, if you're interested in grafting techniques, that's a whole other subject, and there's lots about it on the internet. But bench grafting basically means I have like young little seedling whips. And I found that you want a rootstock that's like at least a 1/4 inch in caliper for grafting. You can graft to any size, and smaller will take just fine, but you'll get not a whole lot of growth that first season. If you graft a 1/4 inch or larger, you can get 2, 3, or more feet of growth in one season easily. As far as temperature goes, they don't really seem to be finicky. So I'll start grafting them as soon as those buds start swelling, which can be in early April sometimes. So they're very easy for me to graft, like 90% take most of the time. And yeah, they're one of the first things I start grafting, and you can graft them all through the season. They don't bleed, or at least I haven't experienced those issues with like sap souring the callus tissue or anything like that. So you don't have to worry about draining the sap or drying out the rootstock before grafting or anything like that.
Very cool.
I've heard some people having some mixed results with like budding and things like that, where it doesn't seem to take as readily. So I haven't played with that method in relation to honey locust. I would just recommend grafting in the spring with bench grafting and your standard whip and tongue or Z graft method.
Great, thank you. Caroline asks, would you recommend this tree for economic growth, and what type of markets would seek that out?
Yeah, great question. I don't know what the board foot cost is on milled honey locust lumber. That's what I assume that's where that question is aimed at. I will say there's probably not enough honey locust trees out there to really bring any significant amount of honey locust to the lumber market. So I think you could really create a niche for yourself by providing that, because it is more of like a niche and specialty timber product. Maybe consult with like whoever your local mill operator is or whatever, and just see if they'd be interested in buying it if you could provide it. I mean, keeping in mind you're still gonna have to wait 20 years for it, but yeah, I think it's a beautiful wood and it's got a lot of potential. I just don't think there's enough of the trees on the landscape to have a real market for it, like oak or tulip poplar or black walnut or anything.
All right, we have one comment and then one more question. The comment was from Michael Gold. It says, just a comment, honey locust thorns are very strong, will go through the bottom of your shoe as well as flatten any tire. And it made me curious if they've ever gone through a crock for you, Zach.
Fortunately not. Usually they're not on the ground, they're on the tree. So that helps. I've definitely like poked myself and in my hands and fingers and stuff. So yeah, they're not to be messed with.
And then a follow-up from the last question was, so someone commented, so 20 years gets you to a harvestable age for wood?
I mean, I threw that out there. It's all going to depend on climate and conditions and soil and all that. But I mean, other fast growing species of which honey locust is, it is a very fast growing species. 20 years isn't out of the question. Depends on what type of saw log you're looking for.
All right. I just closed the questions. We're going to ask one more and then we're going to wrap it up. Wade asks, do you know of any research grazing coppiced honey locusts? My cattle love the fresh new leaf regrowth after I cut down wild locusts in my pastures. And then someone also commented on like good question and has a comment about pollarding, but love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, so I think coppicing and pollarding would both be great practices for a silvopasture system. I think pollarding potentially could be less of a management headache than coppicing, because if you pollard at like 6 feet, let's say, you're sort of above the browse height of cows and deer and things like that. So you can let that pollard reestablish itself. Whereas if you coppice the tree in the pasture and give it no protection, they might just hammer on those shoots until the tree can't really recover. So yeah, it depends on how you graze, how you manage. Like with a lot of these things, it's your choices are gonna change depending on what you're trying to do.
And then our follow-up comment on that is from someone who says they're planning on pollarding and they're curious if you have to choose one or the other if you want pods. Like, will you get pods from a coppice?
In my experience, you won't get pods immediately. They're going to need 2 or 3 years to get large enough to push out pods again. So they're not like a mulberry or at least a white mulberry where they'll fruit on like the young wood. So I think pollard would be a better bet if you're trying to get pod production, because you can keep those ones up above the browse height. And yeah.
Wonderful. Folks have thrown out some really great stuff in the chat, so take a look at that quickly before you leave. Someone made a nod to Ben Falk's work with Locust as a hedgerow. Someone and pleaching, I believe. Shanna Hansen in Maine, re-goats and pollarding. Yes, I forget the name. Do you know where to send people to see Shanna's stuff, Zach? I always forget the name of that farm.
I forget too. I
It's
know she's in
Googleable.
Maine.
Yeah, it's Googleable.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Zach, for being here, especially. Really just so pleasant to listen to all the knowledge that you've got to share. And yeah, I just thank you. You're such a nice, calm, chill presence, and just enjoy being around you and happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah.
It's
All
nice
right,
to geek
y'all.
out on something.
Yeah, it is.
All right.
Well, happy holidays
Thanks,
to
everybody.
everybody, and we'll see you around the bend. Take care.
Sounds good.